Welcome back to the Core Learning channel. Today we are going to be doing more power and conflict poetry, and we are going to start with Remains. As always, like, subscribe and comment anything that you would like me to go over or any videos that you would like me to make. They don't just have to be power and conflict poems, they can be any poems. So we are going to look at Remains by Simon Armitage, and it is a conflict poem. So in your anthologies you will see power poems, you will see conflict poems. Remains is very much a conflict poem. Now, some of the questions that could come up could be something about the power of memory or the power of trauma, but it does always link back to the conflict that he was in. So before we start, I'm going to go over some key vocabulary that you will need to know in order to access this video. The first word I'm going to use a lot is colloquialism. Now, this is chatty language. So language you would hear when speaking to someone very informally, more like a conversation. Adverbs, these are words that usually end in ly and are used to describe a verb or adjective in more detail. So I will be going over those too. PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's a mental health condition caused by a traumatic event. It causes persistent intrusive thoughts and flashbacks to the trauma. So you will be reliving this trauma again and again and again. And that's what PTSD is. Then there's caesura, and that's a complete pause in a line of poetry, usually through punctuation. I'm going to look at one of these, or an example of this, and we are going to look at a full stop in the middle of a line of poetry. So if you need to now, you can pause the video, keep a sort of track of these, write these down if you need them. I would also recommend that if you are watching this video to annotate your anthology, that you write these in now, and you write the definitions of them in now by pausing the video. Okay, so some key context. So this is your AO3. This is where you are going to get your AO3 marks from. So your AO3, it doesn't have to be huge. I don't want anyone to sit in their exam and write a bunch of history or a bunch of context without analysing it. So your AO3 should always be linked to something that you are saying that is analytical. So if you are saying something that is about a technique, you can link some AO3 in there. Okay, so don't just sit there and sort of write tons and tons of context without any analysis of the poem. So this is important because it's going to link to a lot of the points I say. So the first one is that The Not Dead was a documentary used to show the effects of PTSD on soldiers who returned home from war. This was broadcast, so this was a documentary on the TV. But Armitage later released a collection of poetry using this name as well, so he was quite inspired. And Remains is from that collection. Now, what's important here is that when you are analysing something, you can add that context about PTSD, but only once you've analysed it. So the conflict in the poem is from a soldier who is uncertain about whether he shot an armed or unarmed man. And this is important, and this is one of the most important things to know about the poem actually, is that soldiers are not meant to kill unarmed civilians, and that's a person who is not a soldier. The person that he shoots is a looter, which means that this is someone who, that there's sort of clearly been some sort of conflict, some sort of riot, and these people have caused some chaos. Now, it does not mean that they can be shot. So he is not sure whether he shot a looter who was armed or a looter who was unarmed. And you are not meant to kill someone who is unarmed, which creates sort of a lot of guilt for the soldier as well, because he's not sure whether he made the right decision. And that's what really haunts him. He displays many symptoms of PTSD, such as disturbed sleep and persistent haunting memories and flashbacks. And we will have a look at those in a second when we launch onto our key quotations. Again, if you are using this video to annotate your anthology, this key context, I'm going to keep coming back to that. So when we're looking at quotations, I'll keep mentioning it. So you don't necessarily need to pause the video now and go over this, but it is good to keep it in your head and to know. So the first key quotation I'm going to go over is probably armed, possibly not. Now this comes up in the first stanza and then is persistently repeated. So that repetition is important. And it shows that that's what his key conflict is around, that he is unsure about the status of the looter. And he says probably armed and possibly not. So the adverbs show uncertainty. When we say probably and possibly, there's no certainty behind them. They don't connote any certainty. We can't zoom in on them and say they are very, very certain. We would say that they show uncertainty, really. Probably is what he wants. He wants to think that that man was probably armed. But this possibility, that's what haunts him. That there is a small chance that that man was unarmed and he did something heinous and terrible in killing him. So he's got that uncertainty there, that he's very unsure of what he's done. The word order is significant because he puts probably armed first, and then he pauses with this comma and then says possibly not. So it's that extra little possibility that's the big issue for him. And that's why it's such an important phrase. And it's a phrase that he keeps repeating to show that this is really what haunts him. So the next quotations I want to go over are, I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. And I'm going to link this to he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. So if you are writing a peel or a peter or a petal paragraph, whatever your school uses, you can put in more than one quotation, especially if they link really well together like these two. So if I were to annotate these in my anthology, I would talk about how they are very brutal. So it is very brutal imagery. So I see every round as it rips through his life. We could zoom in on that verb rips. That's important. It kind of dehumanizes him, actually. It makes him seem less than human. When something rips, it means that it's normally delicate. So he's looking at the way the man is portrayed to be delicate, and that his life was very delicate. So it rips through his life. A round is a round of bullets. So he's really showing how he saw this man's life sort of disappear before his eyes, and that's quite traumatic in itself. Then we have the phrase, I see broad daylight on the other side. Now, broad daylight could symbolize the light. So when you say the phrase, I see the light, normally you mean that you see the truth. Normally that you mean that you have seen some sort of big reveal. So when he says, I see broad daylight on the other side, it could show how he was sort of brutally ripped apart, but it could also show that he is seeing, after he has done this, he sort of immediately sees the mistake that he could have made, and he sees the light immediately, and he's unsure about what he has just done. So that could be an alternative reading of it. Then we link it to he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. Now again, we've got this colloquialism of sort of. He sounds a bit dismissive. He sounds a bit like he's playing this down. But he also sounds like he can't quite describe it when he says he's sort of inside out. Now that's very brutal in itself, that he's inside out, that we can literally see his insides. But there's this colloquialism there, which kind of shows how he's being sort of almost chatty about it, because he's trying to explain it and he's failing. And he's really bringing our attention to the horror of it, but it doesn't sound as serious. Now, what's interesting about this is that the entire poem is like a dramatic monologue. So it's one person talking, and they're talking at us. So he is talking at us about this moment. And I think the colloquialism kind of helps to show him to be more human and to feel more like we're having a conversation with him, like he's trying to describe it to us as though we were a friend rather than a reader. And I think that creates sort of a bond between us and him. It feels very much like we're having a conversation with him. And so when he says sort of, it really is showing us that he is almost lost for the words here. So that's a really important one. And I would definitely link that to the brutal imagery that we see in that stanza. Then we go on to even more colloquialisms. So one of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body, then he's carted off in the back of a lorry. Now, the verbs are really important here, carted and toss. And we see this kind of, this very uncaring, we get this very uncaring impression, like he is just sort of disposed of. And it's important that we are being drawn to this moment. And I think the writer has done that on purpose, because he wants us to see how brutal war is, that he has shot this man and then he is just sort of taken away so quickly, so easily. There's no respect in the way he's taken. And I think that shows how affected he is by how little the man was cared for after he died. But he cares. He cares about what happened. He cares about that moment. And I think it's very lonely. I think he feels like he's the only person who cares. And it really shows the brutal reality of war. Now, this is where we actually start linking it really well to War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy, in this idea of how affected one person can be and how unaffected other people can be. And we will talk about that in a War Photographer video and a comparison video as well. But there is a moment in that last stanza of War Photographer where he's staring impassively at where he makes his living, and they do not care, because the war photographer sees all these horrible realities every day, but then he stares from the plane at Britain, at, you know, his home country, and he realizes that no one really understands just what he's seen. No one understands how horrible it is. And I think there's definitely that sort of moment here where Simon Armitage is drawing our attention to the fact that this man wasn't cared for, and yet he has such a profound effect on the man who killed him. So then I have 3 quotations that I would link together as well, because they all come back to that idea of PTSD. Then I'm home on leave, but I blink. Now, the caesura pauses us for a second. Then I'm home on leave, but I blink. Now, there's this sort of turning point in this poem here, this difference between war and home. And actually, what Armitage is trying to do there with that sort of weird turning point is to show us that there really isn't that much of a difference between war and home for this man, because people with PTSD don't go home. They stay at war. They very much stay at war, because their minds are constantly drawn back to war. So when he says, then I'm home on leave, full stop, but I blink, that's the moment he's transported back to war. So he's never really actually leaving it. And that reflects how PTSD flashbacks work. Then we've got sleep and dream. So we've got these 2 sort of verbs here to show what he can't do anymore. So he can't rest without that persistent memory, which does link to PTSD as well, because he is constantly drawn back to those flashbacks, to that moment of trauma. And this shows the lasting impact of war as well, this worry that he has. Now then we've got the line, the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. Now this one links really well to some context here, because it's one of the most common coping mechanisms of people with PTSD. They normally turn to addictions in order to help them to cope with what they're going through. So he's trying desperately, and he's sort of drawing attention to the fact that these aren't healthy coping mechanisms and they aren't working for him as well. So during this sort of turn of the poem, we're meant to see a contrast between what life is like at war and what life is like at home. But actually, Armitage really kind of molds them together. and shows that there isn't much of a difference for this man, and that this soldier is very much still living the same moment over and over and over again, like someone with PTSD. So our last quotation is "near to the knuckle, here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands." Those are the last two lines of the poem. Now, this is an allusion to Macbeth. If you have done Macbeth, you will know that after murdering the king, Macbeth thinks his hands will never be clean, and his wife hallucinates blood on their hands. Now, for 400 years, since Macbeth was first performed, bloody hands have come to symbolise guilt. And that's just something that's sort of in the English language now. So it comes from Macbeth. It was invented by Shakespeare, but it's something that's come to symbolise guilt. By saying he has blood on his hands, he is literally saying he feels like a murderer. So now that we can see that when he says bloody life, it could be sort of like a way for him to curse, a curse word. But actually, when he says his bloody hands, that being the last phrase that we hear shows that guilt again, and it links back to that probably armed, possibly not, that he isn't sure, so he's wondering whether he murdered someone who was innocent, and he sees himself as a murderer right at the end. He says that he has blood on his hands, he has bloody hands, just like Macbeth, just like his wife, just like murderers. So we do see a real tragic ending to this poem, and that's quite important. So when you go through this poem and you use those quotations to annotate, you might notice that there are more quotations in there that you could sort of link to this, and you could link to this bitterness that he has. And don't be afraid to actually go over them too. Now, these are just the ones that I would always know for my exam, and I would always draw attention to. And I think they are the ones that are going to link particularly well to War Photographer, which in my opinion is the best one to link to remains in an exam if you are going to compare sort of the effects or the lasting effects of war. So, thank you for listening. Thank you for going through this. Hopefully that is going to help you annotate or answer an essay question. Don't forget, like, subscribe and comment any videos that you would like me to do.